Mark, you are the managing director at the National Collegiate Athletics Association. Before we go there, and welcome again on the show, this has been filmed for the purposes, as I've said, for the Safe Bet Show, one of the live episodes. As a foreigner, maybe a dumb foreigner, I've always struggled, that will be my first question, as to how the moniker for the National Collegiate Athletics Association is meant to be pronounced. Because I've heard NCAA, NCAA, I suppose. NCAA is for the lazy folks. NC2A. So what's your take? Let's kick it off before we move on to the more in-depth issues.
I hope that's the toughest question I get today.
May not be.
Interestingly, I started about 18 years ago under Dr. Miles Brand. And at that time, there were really strict rules around saying NCAA. And then somewhere along the way, that just went away. So it can be anything you want it to be. Four-letter word.
I like NCAA. That's shorter and sweeter. So if I may stick to that, I'll do that. And that's a nice segue into the first question, because we are going to talk, and this is my cheat sheet for the record. You've been with the NCAA for quite some time. So really, to kick things off, could you tell us what kind of roles you have had, and then walk the audience through your current remit, just to set the scene and get us going?
Yeah, thank you. I've had a really unique experience at the NCAA. It has been 18 years. Prior to that, I was a football coach and had never spent anywhere longer than 4 seasons, 3.5 years. And so when I went to Indianapolis as a law clerk, I just imagined, I guess, that I would be there just a couple years and move on. But I did get hired out of law school into a regulatory group called our Academic and Membership Affairs. So it's essentially our legislative group. They interpret the bylaws. They had touch points to governance. And I had the opportunity to work there for about a year, and then left the NCAA as we started a startup entity called the Eligibility Center. For those of you who are maybe a little older and maybe played college athletics, there used to be a thing called the Clearinghouse, and the Eligibility Center took the place of the Clearinghouse. And so really unique opportunity to kind of be a part of a startup with somebody else's money. And did that, primarily worked in areas of academic fraud and initial eligibility, and then back in 2013 got hired into enforcement to start essentially an external relations group that it specializes in specific sports and then specific issues. So things like, football, men's and women's basketball. We have an NIL person that works for me now, and in that area was also sports betting. And so had a colleague named Mark Hicks, who some of you may know or knew. He passed away a little over a year ago, but had an opportunity to work with Mark, and we, again, focused on sports betting. So that's it, around the block.
And our commiserations again, because Mark was a great man. Some of us here, looking at Paul Buck, we've had the privilege and pleasure of knowing him, and it's such a shame that he passed away at such a relatively young age. Perhaps another off-the-cuff question, I suppose. Not everybody's Bill Belichick or Andy Reid, even. You left every single team you coached in 3.5, 4 seasons. Why was that?
Say, where was I coaching? Oh, I coached in North Carolina and Mississippi. I worked in both high school and college football as well. I coached Division II football. So did that for almost a decade prior to going to law school.
And 3 seasons per team, I suppose. that's enough. It's a tough enough job. I suppose moving on to the rather, if I may, and you've seen the questions in advance and you haven't raised any hue and cry, so I presume I do may. It's a sensitive topic, but I can imagine that a lot of folks here would like to hear that answer, and I'd be remiss in my duties as a podcast host if I didn't ask. So historically, NCAA has taken a rather negative stance on sports betting. So I would really love to hear more about the rationale behind it, and then we can move on to talk about your reassessment or the reassessment of your relationship with sports betting led by President Baker?
Yeah, so obviously the policy, anti-betting policy, way precedes my time, and I think when you told me you're going to ask that question, I did a little research and also just reflecting on my time and the people that I worked with that came before me, and it's interesting that there have been about 15 sports wagering based, sports betting based integrity law enforcement issues over the last 50 years at the NCAA. So point shaving, I mean, like you have Toledo football back in 2008, 9, something like that, San Diego basketball, but it goes all the way back to the 50s. And so I think between the legality of just across the country and then some pretty severe integrity issues, I think probably led most likely to that stance that again preceded my time there, and and if you kind of split that with then that pre-PASPA lens, if you will, to the post-PASPA lens, you get into a much different viewpoint. It's sports betting is here. We have to embrace it. We have a president who was the governor of Massachusetts when they legalized sports betting there. And so I think you have someone there in our leadership that has a real understanding of the issues and really has embraced the fact that it's here and we're coexisting in that space. I think one of the policy things that's quite a bit different, though, is, and it ties into responsible gaming, is the student athlete welfare piece. And so I think the policies that went into NCAA legislation years and years and years ago really were integrity focused, again, illegal. But now we're starting to see a lot more focus on the student athlete well-being. You're seeing the data. And so I think that's another part of our legislation now that really has evolved over the last 5-6 years.
And we'll come on to talk about athletes or even the wider students' well-being. And I suppose the next question, feel free not to answer, but I would love to hear the answer without you falling foul of any confidentiality obligations. So to the extent you can tell us, you've already hinted at the principles behind the debate, but where does that internal debate within NCAA, I mean on sports betting, stand right now? Or where do you think it is headed, as I've said, to the extent you're allowed to share with the illustrious audience here?
So let me make sure I understand. So where our advocacy efforts are going, or?
Advocacy efforts are going, where are your reassessment efforts going?
Yeah, we break down everything into two buckets. So it's everything that we do strategic is going to tie to student athlete welfare or integrity. And I think right now we're so focused on the student athlete well-being part. Harassment is something that we're dealing with. Our student athletes, participants, officials, coaches are dealing with. It's actually quite dramatic. We hired a group called Signify to do some social media monitoring through March Madness, and their systems flagged about 50,000. So both men's and women's tournaments, they flagged about 50,000 posts or messages that were deemed to be offensive or abusive. About 4,000 of those were turned over to social media companies and law enforcement, and they rose to that level. And about 15% of those were directly tied to language around sports betting. And so that's a big focus. The other side of it is the integrity concern. And again, that has been there all along. So anything we do strategically is going to be tied to one of those two principles. And I think, it was really interesting to listen to the panel before with Lou and Kathy, just talking about consistency. And that's one of the things I think that we'd like to see state to state is just really consistent application of regulatory principles.
Perhaps for a bit may stick to those harassment messages, and that's something absolutely despicable. So what would they typically say? Because what I'm picturing is that for gamesmanship reasons, somebody might slide on the 2-yard line without scoring because it's done to secure the team's win, and it's the logical thing to do, but I can imagine there might be quite a few bettors out there who would be tearing their hair out for no good reason, because it's, as you've said, even against the integrity of the game. But no, he should have crossed the line, he should have scored a touchdown, and then very unfortunately unleash that abuse by the means of rather anonymous platforms of social media. So am I on the right track? Is that what those messages are about, or can it get even worse?
Yeah, we've seen where people will send their Venmo account to a student athlete saying, "You owe me," right? A lot of really, actually, and not to make fun of it, like really, really terrible things. And the women athletes experience 3 times more harassment than the men. And so not all of it's sports betting related. You can just imagine some of the terrible things that are said on the women's side. But it's racism, homophobic messages, things around our transgender policies, and then on top of it, just some of the betting stuff that's specific to like, you cost me money, right? So threats, again, I don't go too deep, but threats on their life, on their families, their homes, that type of thing, stuff that 18 to 22-year-olds really shouldn't have to experience.
As I've said, very regrettable, if not despicable. It's a segue into a next question about the wider topic of athletes' well-being. So I'm flipping the script a little bit. We will come back to prop bets.
Yeah.
But what is it that the NCAA has been doing to further enhance the levels of protection that are being afforded, not only to athletes, because they're arguably one of the more vulnerable groups, but the wider student demographic? So what is it they're getting?
Yeah.
What's the pathway?
Good question. So, understanding our dynamic, we're not the NFL. We're not Major League Baseball or the NBA. We're 500,000 student athletes. And then on top of that, you have staff on campuses that probably, under our umbrella, probably around 250,000, maybe 500,000. We don't really know exactly, but you're talking about 1 million people. And with, again, half of those being the student athletes. And so the way we protect, the way we get to those people has to be very diverse, right? So there's a role that our campuses play. And they're plugged into law enforcement. They're also responsible for educating their student athletes and their staff. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. Our role at the national office is to help supply them with resources. We mentioned Signify. We do things with Epic Risk Management, or Global Solutions rather, and to make sure that we're bringing awareness to issues. We have a mental health advisory committee that's just put out some new study and new work around the mental health aspects that are connected to gaming. And so there's a lot of different things we do, but it's a fabric that is woven together by a lot of different elements. We do keep a good relationship with federal agencies at a national level. And then we also, at the national office, are really trying to build good, strong relationships with our regulatory communities so that we, again, first name basis, if there's an issue, that we want them to know how to get in touch with us, and then we want to go back to them. So it's kind of a complicated, Martin, but there's a lot of different things there, different layers of protection and awareness.
And I'm sure that the student and the student athletes truly appreciate all the work that you guys have been doing, talking about, because this is the Player Protection Symposium, so let's talk RG. RG in this country, you personally as well as the organization have had, I would venture to guess, quite some exposure to the gambling industry by now. So what is maybe your personal view on how, as an industry, we've approached responsible gambling? Now, I'm not trying to ask a leading question, but it would appear, and there are lots of folks in the room, no, we wouldn't have had that many 4 years ago. So as I've said, great to see you. Or it's gaining more and more prominence. New RG-focused organizations such as Roga and others are springing up. So what is your take? Because as I've said, you're having exposure, but you're not an industry insider. So you might even be able to help us, a fresh pair of eyes, as they say.
Well, it's you're right. I'm not an insider, and I wasn't here years ago to see how it's evolved. But what I can tell you is, like, right now it seems very exciting because the attention that's placed into responsible gambling. I have a good friend, Clint Martin knows, and others may know him, and I want to give him credit for this. But, like, you know, we look at RG efforts as protecting the gamblers, and we have a different responsibility, and that's to protect the people who are they're gambling on, right? So that's another layer for us as well. But it's an exciting time. I think in the panel before they were talking about the emergence of all these different RG efforts, and it seems like there's probably room for everybody. And I've heard you, Martin, say, like, your industry probably should do more about trumpeting the things that you are doing. And I have had that visibility to see what you all are doing, and then what other entities are starting to do around RG efforts. So we need all the help we can get.
Let's talk about the program that you guys have with your partner, Epic. Nice save there, by the way. Epic Global Solutions. In my book, well, I'm biased because I'm sort of involved, but it's been a great partnership. Just to give the audience, because you're only too familiar with them, a few numbers. Now, only in 2023, the Epic facilitators have led 290 sessions. I'm looking at Paul Buck, he can correct me, at 90 colleges up and down this country, and reached some 25,000 student athletes. That's just phenomenal numbers. But from your perspective, what kind of impact has the program had on the athletes populace? And I suppose beyond, because athletes, I would suggest, they tend to talk to their peers, the other students.
Yeah, I mean, I assume everybody knows about the lived experience that the Epic produces. And again, we are the beneficiaries of that work and Intain Foundation's work in supporting Epic. And, we certainly couldn't do it without a whole group of people on campuses and then the financial support that Epic receives. So the impact itself, lived experience is just so dramatically different than anything that we would have done at the NCAA or that the campus compliance people are doing, where they're going to stand up and go through the rules. Here's the rule, don't break it. If you have a problem, here are some things you need to do. It's very mechanical, but the lived experience is so different. And the survey feedback we're getting is that it really hits home to our students, but it's not just limited to students, and you make a good point. It's our staff and the coaches that are there. And then I think, I've heard the facilitators from Epic say this to me on a number of different occasions, that almost always a student athlete will come up after the session and tell them about something that's happening in their personal life with a parent or their roommate or somebody else. And so I think, that it expands. It's not just the audience that's hearing it, but they're starting to think in terms of gambling and gambling harm and how it's hitting them in other aspects of their life. And so I do think, we don't have data on how far it ripples out, but I'm convinced it does. So I think it's just it's certainly a different type of education and awareness that has great benefits.
And I believe you just hit the perfect tone when talking about the loved ones, because it may not be the student athlete in the room who may be having a problem. It could be that student's partner, it could be that student's parent, it could be a guy who lives down the road. They just happen to be friends. So as someone who's been heavily involved with the college populace in this country, how would you go, or how do you think we can go about spreading the word even further? Because of course, as I've said, I may be biased, but the sessions, the lived experience sessions that Epic provide are fabulous. There are folks in the room. So do you believe that they will come home and just talk to mom and dad? Oh, look, we've done that. not necessarily the same day, they would be at campus, most of them, but when they come home, oh, we had this session about that, and where do you stand on all this, mom and dad? Do you think that it may have this effect, it may go this far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I would imagine those conversations happen. And I think it's just really important for all of us in this industry to continue to find different ways to message. And you know, another interesting thing about the NCAA is that of that half a million student athletes, we're going to lose about 20% every year because they cycle out from an eligibility standpoint. So you have a whole new crop every year. And when I say crop, a whole new class of student athletes, a little over 100,000 brand new people coming in. By the way, one of the things that we do hear from our student athletes, and we have a big survey that's taking place right now that'll be out this summer. They'll survey about 20,000 student athletes, probably the largest survey of its kind. But they almost exclusively say they started betting. Those that are involved in betting almost exclusively began betting prior to arriving at college. So it was really, really young people. One of the things that we're going to have Epic do this year is they're going to be at our college basketball academy. And the college basketball academy is it's a basketball camp essentially for about 1,200 boys and girls, prospective student athletes, so high school age. So this summer they'll hit 1,200 youth, and I think that's probably the next frontier, right? Is getting to people earlier. Because by the time they get to us in college, and they've been betting for a while already, those things are pretty ingrained.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that has been the perennial question: at what age we should start educating, for want of better expression, kids about the vagaries of sports betting and online gambling. That's from my experience. In some instances, it turned out to be rather controversial. You know, and kids, I mean, even 14, 15, 16-year-old, they would come home and go, "Oh, we talk about betting today at school," and the parents may be horrified. Right. So, what would be your? Again, I appreciate that would be your personal take, and another off-the-cuff question because we've still got some time. What would be your take on that? Isn't it a little too late? Of course, that education at the college level is extremely important. But if these guys were to come at it cold, shouldn't we consider across the spectrum, legislators, regulators, the industry, parents, that this kind of education should sit right next to education about, for want of better expression, other perhaps controversial topics or some of the vices, sexual education, alcohol, and all that?
Yeah, again, speaking, personally, it's something I talk to my kids about. I have a 9th grader and a 6th grader. I choose to talk to them about it because they see the advertisements and they're talking to me about it. And they know a little bit about my job and my role, but for the most part, it's everyday part of their lives. My son comes home, wants to play fantasy football or whatever, and so it's an opportunity for me to talk to them about that. And so personally, I like this. I understand it could be controversial, but at the same time, it's out there, so I'd like. It seems reasonable to me that we want to have those conversations a little earlier than maybe we currently do.
Moving on, if I may, sports integrity. I'm really building up to a brief debate about prop bets, because I'm sure a lot of folks here would love to hear your take on that. But sports integrity, it's not only an area that is built into, not baked into the EPIC program. But overall, the key message I would suggest, feel free to disagree, is twofold. Do not commit the mortal sin of betting on your own team. And even when you're of age and you choose to bet, do it responsibly, because it's needless to say consequences of falling foul of these principles, again, I would suggest might be absolutely dire. Let's just look at a couple of names. Shane Pinto is back playing hockey, great. He had to sit out half of the season. And Jonte Parker, he's got banned for life. Mm-hmm. So is NCAA's position aligned with this approach? So besides protecting the athlete's well-being that we've already talked about abundantly, would you agree that there's an absolute need to protect the integrity of the game or the games that your student athletes engage in and engage with?
Yeah, no doubt. Absolutely. And I said earlier, like we have a history, it's sad, but we do have a history where integrity's been part of the, our contest going back to the 1950s. And so it is something we take very, very seriously. And it just seems like there's even more risk today than there was in the past. There's so many different types of markets that are offered. There are more and more games, sports that are being bet on, and not just here in the U.S., but in markets outside the United States, betting on a whole laundry list of college sports, whether it's ice hockey, women's ice hockey, volleyball is an expanding sport from a betting perspective. Women's basketball is starting to really climb in popularity from a betting perspective. And so anyway, there's lots of different opportunities on the integrity side of things. We talked about NIL. So, NIL, this whole new world of student athletes having more money. But what comes with NIL is exposure to boosters and collectives, people that want to do business with a student athlete or get closer to the student athlete. And just a couple of years ago, those relationships really didn't exist, certainly not as formal. So now you've introduced a whole group of people that are connected to the student athletes that relationship didn't happen. You have NIL agents. So you have third parties now that have, a lot more access and visibility to when somebody's going to play or when somebody has a broken foot or is in a boot that might be distracted, that might not play as well. And so there, again, you have this whole other world of people that just wasn't nearly as formally connected to student athletes just a couple of years ago. When I talk to agents at the federal level, I think that's an area of concern for them. They know that there are people, very entrepreneurial people, who look for weaknesses and ways to gain in the betting space. And so I think the NIL really adds some risk that didn't exist prior. One might think, well, they're making NIL money, so now they don't need to engage in match fixing or whatever, or even betting. But Jonte Porter is an NBA player, and I don't know for sure, but someone said his salary is around $400,000 a year, so which is probably more than most kids are making NIL. I know we read headlines where kids are making a lot more, but that's at best a very, very, very small amount of people. So.
No, it's truly mind-boggling with my sort of the Brazilian, and there's method to this madness, so bear with me, Brazilian regulatory hat on it. Still unfathomable for me why the likes of Lucas Paqueta, who happens to play for a Premier League soccer team, would have engaged in match fixing, because the guy's making a fortune. I don't know, Might have been a cousin of his down in Brazil, but I take it that you believe that the key risk comes down to the third parties that all of a sudden turn up on the scene and got involved. But I'm really thinking out loud, wouldn't there also be a potential risk within the team itself? To model an example, to your point, you would have your star quarterback who may have just landed a 5-year NIL deal or 3-year NIL deal, to make it aligned with the curriculum, with a brand X, making a lot of money, and you would have his backup, or with all due respect, the third stringer, but they happen to sit in the same locker room, and you talked about the niggles. He might have seen the guy limping off the field, so I'm not suggesting that person would necessarily do something untoward, but there would appear to be an additional pressure resulting from the NIL deals, because these guys may not get the opportunity, and then advertently, hopefully not, but even inadvertently, they may go and talk to someone who would pass that information on, and it may trigger a chain reaction. So Would you agree that, and feel free to disagree, that to my mind, that's an additional risk?
No, for sure. I mean, and we have those concerns. And in that inside information piece is alive and well. I mean, that's something that we expect our schools to educate on. We educated on it from the national level, but it's a message that being very, very careful with information. Another thing to think about. Again, we're not the NFL, we're not Major League Baseball, whatever, but our student athletes are essentially live in an Olympic Village every day, right? So they're going to class with student athletes from other sports. They're using the same trainer. So the trainer that's taping ankles for the baseball player is probably taping ankles for the basketball team, right? They go to the same academic advisors. And so there's a whole bunch of people who are living and working together on a daily basis who have a lot of inside information. And that's, I think, unique compared to some of the pro sports where there's information, people on the inside, but I think it's just so different with college athletics.
Totally. Before we hit the home straight here, suppose we can't escape it. Prop bets, finally, proposition bets. So in the last few months, President Baker himself, it would appear, from an outsider's view, industry insider, NCAA outsider, has led the charge on, I suppose, making proposition bets in connection with NCAA tournaments safer. So what's the motive or rationale behind the policy, and what's the current state of play? The likes of Ohio, you worked very closely with them, a few other states, they've adopted changes to their regulations.
Yeah, so the motivation, I think President Baker, as I mentioned earlier, certainly brought in his own, I don't know if lessons is the right word, but experiences, I guess, going through legalization of sports betting in Massachusetts. I think this is a topic that's on his mind. He's very passionate about it, but it goes back to the things we talked about before. I mean, he's very bothered by the harassment and the player proposition bets, where the bet is specific to the statistical performance of an individual 18 to 22-year-old, feels like that's putting an additional target on their back. So that is where I think he immediately goes. There is some additional risk from an integrity standpoint. We realize that. And again, that's always been a concern for us. But I think now with all these different types of player proposition bets, there's more opportunity for integrity concerns or integrity breaches. And the other thing that we haven't talked about, but it's something that we should recognize, is that I often and routinely get prohibited bettor cases of such as sent to us because of our rules and a lot of the state regulations around reporting prohibited bettor issues when it comes to NCAA athletics. And so we are seeing more and more situations where the student athlete is betting on themselves. Fortunately, so far, most of those have been on them to bet on themselves to do better, to bet the over, if you will. But to me, it's a really difficult trend when you start having players who are engaging in betting on themselves. There's been some in the public, but I can tell you it's happening, and it's happening pretty often. So on the debate side, and I know where you are, or we've talked about this a number of times, and I also fully get that there is a risk that some of these bets now go to an unregulated market. So I get that, and it is something we've talked a lot about. We're also, though, and it goes to the panel before, they were talking about the importance of getting after the unregulated market too. And I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. So we're really bothered by the unregulated market. We're going to continue to implore the federal authorities and others to do their role there. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. And so I think, at least from our viewpoint, that target on that student athlete's back, removing that hopefully helps in some ways. And and if the industry, the operators, want to help us in harassment and deal with that, then maybe there are things that they can do too. We're not going to turn that down, right? So.
I'd venture, I guess, that everybody in this room and beyond would it about the black market, especially in the great Empire State, but I shall digress. 8-minute warning, 6 minutes. You cut down 2 minutes somehow, magic. Okay, 6-minute warning before we give the audience a chance to ask a few questions. Let me wrap our conversation up by talking about the phenom that Caitlin Clark has become. I was watching March Madness. Normally, and this will sound awful, but the main act is the men's tournament. But the last few seasons, thanks to Caitlin, I would suggest, it's been the women's tournament. Now, in your view, what makes her so special, and how far do you believe she will go in her future career? Because my personal view is she's the answer to the question, or my answer to the question everybody's had since time immemorial. Is MJ or LeBron the greatest basketball player that's ever graced those courts? No, it's Caitlin Clark. What's your take?
Yeah, well, she's amazing, obviously. And first of all, she's dynamic, right? What a clutch performer at really, really important times. But I think most importantly, what she's done is really help elevate that stage, because there's a lot of good women basketball players. And so I think that just the buzz around the game has been tremendous. She brings that to the table. But she's had, rivalries, and I think whether it was last year and then in UConn this year, like that, those marquee matchups that involve Caitlin, I think they really have elevated the game. And we're lucky we're in Indianapolis, so we get a front row seat to see what she can do at the WBA.
We shall indeed wish the Indiana Fever the best of luck. Anybody? I think we have time for about one question, then I'll ask Mark to wrap it up. Oh, we're doing the anonymous thing again, so thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous. As NC launched, Epic played a large part in teaching student athletes. How often do they re-educate student athletes due to transfer portal becoming larger year on year?
Yeah, is one of the strategies that we worked with Epic on is just how to re-engage. Scope is an issue. 500,000 student athletes is a lot, and so we do have some schools that will have Epic come back from year to year. But we also know the way kids move around student athletes move around in the transfer portal. They're more than likely not to hit them up a second time. So we continue to try to fund that thing and bring more life to the program.
Let's try to squeeze the second anonymous one in. How do you balance the need for transparency on student-athlete wagering and their privacy? The Iowa case puts into the light how the privacy element can be abused.
I think I need my regulatory friends up here to help on this one. That's one of the great things about playing college athletics is that you abide by the team and you're playing under a certain set of rules. And I think our student athletes know that when it comes to betting on college sports, basically it's a pretty bright line. And so where that blends into lack of privacy or privacy issues, again, that's probably better for our regulatory folks. But I think our student athletes have that commitment when they're playing to refrain from betting on college sports.
And I'll be generous today. It's normally 60 seconds. You have nearly 2 minutes to convey your key messages to the audience, please.
When I thought about the opportunity to be here, and first of all, thanks to SBC, Martin. Thanks for inviting me and the work you're doing to support Epic and all that Intane does. But I just really, it's been fascinating to watch this industry evolve the way it has in just the last couple of years. Really excited about the RG work. It's great to see such a large crowd here for this specific topic of player protection. It's something that is at the forefront of what we're trying to do at the NCAA. I know sometimes our rules may seem rigid, archaic at times, but 500,000 student athletes, 1,100 plus members. So you don't have, President Baker's not a commissioner. He doesn't get to just say, this is what we're going to do. It's not 30 teams. There are a lot of cooks in that kitchen. So change comes slow at the NCAA, a lot of committee structure. But I'm really excited about the stuff we're doing and the partnerships that we have and the ground we've made as we coexist with sports betting. So.
Thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, we have learned, I would suggest, much more than what the NCAA moniker, how it's meant to be, pronounced properly. Please put it together for Mark Hicks, Managing Director at NCAA. Thank you very much.